My name is Sirena LaBurn, and I'm here today with Billy Hassell at his exhibition titled The Giving Ground at Foltz Fine Art, on view through January 2024. Billy, the title of the exhibition is The Giving Ground, which is based on a print made in 1992. Why did this title seem appropriate for this show happening 30 years later?
Well, I had been producing the paintings for this show for a while, for almost, well, on and off for a year, but intensely in the last 6 months. And my go-to is to go to subject matter I'm familiar with, and this happens to be almost all places in Texas, based on places in Texas. And I usually try to think of a title that is not too specific, but sort of conjures up an idea. And I had done this print back I started it in 1991, and it may have been editioned in 1993, but I thought it's almost 30 years from the creation of that print. And that print was commissioned by the Nature Conservancy of Texas, which to me represented a kind of a turning point in I guess you could call it a career, my vocation as an artist. I've been doing work based on wildlife and nature, really based on nature, that kind of had begun to focus on birds, and was approached by the Nature Conservancy to do a limited edition print based on some areas in Texas, specifically the Edwards Aquifer near Austin. And I really was aware of conservation and the environmental issues and all that, but the experience of doing that print and meeting people and talking to people really educated me a lot about what was out there, what was endangered, and what was really at risk. And it just gave me a much greater appreciation of, the world around us, the natural world, which has always been inspiring to me. But that, it's sort of like taking a walk in the woods. You can appreciate it, just the being there. But if you begin to know the names of the trees and be able to identify, not that I can identify every plant, but that, like if the trees kind of become personalities, and the birds and the animals, if you know what they are and know a little bit about them, and it just enhances the experience. So I consider that working on that print, like I said, a real turning point, and what was started out as like a side project for this conservation group really became a more of a central part of my mission as an artist. And I still consider what I do personal, and my response to it is very individual and unique to me and my experiences, but that's definitely a component to it. So since there wasn't any specific area addressed in this show, it's a lot about the Gulf Coast, like the painting behind us, and there's some paintings from East Texas. There are paintings based on the Trans-Pecos area, West Texas, and then more recently, some of the most recent paintings are based on the North Texas rolling plains, which is where I live, where my studio is, and so that regional area has crept into the work as well. So the title, The Giving Ground, to me was kind of encompassed all of that. That it's and I think I like that phrase. I like words where there could be a turn of phrase, like a word like trace. It can either be trace a line, or it's also another meaning of the word is a path. Mm-hmm. And giving ground. If I always look up when I get an idea for a title of a show, I'll look it up and see what else might come to mind. And without the like giving ground, also implies retreating, like giving in. Like if you're having, if you're in a confrontational situation, it can mean backing down, backing away from it, sort of giving ground, giving some space to the other. And in a way, I was trying to think of a positive way of thinking about that. But that's really, that's sort of a secondary meaning for the word and the way I've used it. I think of it more like the Native Americans that consider the earth that's all life came from the earth. And so that's my, interpretation of it, is that it's, the earth is where life comes from. And it's like the idea of Mother Earth. And so that's my implication. But if it had to be, if you interpreted it as giving that was inevitable or overpowering or whatever, I'm kind of okay with that too, because it's like, instead of, trying to be in control of something, you're sort of letting the other have, participate more or have the space it needs. So I kind of like both meanings.
Giving space maybe to the animals, to the land, to the space. And I also think about giving space to the painting, perhaps. Sometimes not imposing our will on the painting, but letting the painting also tell us sometimes what it means.
Exactly. Well, and giving the space for, I think we tend to think of ourselves as, I don't know what the word for it is, but that, the world revolves around us as human beings, and that all the other wildlife and birds and animals, and they're all the other. Mm-hmm. And we're really all one. We all share the same space. We share the same earth. So in that sense, the giving, giving ground, letting the other occupy some of that space is, and I guess the paintings kind of do that too, in a physical way. They're also occupants of the world, but that
Space.
question. But
and moments to the animals. So when I think about some of the paintings that are very full of, like the painting behind you, which is the Smith Oaks Rookery, High Island, Texas, dedicated to Frank X. Talbert, which was the last painting made for the show. It has so much happening in it. There's so many different types of birds coming together. So I'm kind of wondering how, when you're coming up with these compositions, all these different animals coming together at one moment, how does that happen? Are you seeing that happening when you're out there, or are you kind of combining separate moments? Or
I think in most of my paintings, they are composites of experiences. Frequently, the landscape will be a very specific place, and those are usually based on watercolors and direct observation, kind of gathered while traveling. But then I populate them later, and a lot of times I try to I consciously put things together that you wouldn't normally see all in one place. They, like, the wildlife is all there, the animals are all there, but some you wouldn't see except in the evening, or one you might get a fleeting glance of. The likelihood of them all being there present at the same time is pretty unlikely. However, with like Smith Oaks, these rookeries, and there are a couple of other paintings that have to do with places like along the Gulf Coast where migratory birds come in. That's not an exaggeration at all. I went to visit Smith Oaks Rookery in June, early June, for the first time a few years ago, and the big migration had already happened, but it was still, all these birds were still there. The roseate spoonbills and the green herons and the egrets, they were all, and the ingas, they were all there nesting. So there are year-round populations, and they're literally that close together. It's sort of mind-boggling to see this variety of birds all congregated. And I guess from what I've read, about the natural history of these areas, is that, at one time, I think a lot of parts of the United States were like that, before civilization, before people came in, that the abundance of wildlife was pretty overwhelming. And I think what we have now are these little pockets, like around this Smith Oaks Rookery's real near the Galveston Bay, sort of near the Bolivar Peninsula, and also just north of there is where the big thicket starts. So there are preserves there, but they're just little isolated preserves. So that also does sometimes tend to intensify the number of birds that gravitate to one area. It's kind of like places, where new homes go in, and the deer and other wild turkeys end up in people's yards because they don't have any place to go. So, or they congregate where there's still a little bit of open space. But that's not an exaggeration. I did, the composition is a little bit of a combination of different views. But I did some watercoloring. When I went there the first time, I spent several days, and I watercolored, and I took a lot of pictures. And some of the pictures, you can see all these birds, the roseate spoonbills and the egrets, and it's, and they're all right there. And there's conveniently an observation deck where you can set up. And I have a scope now that, instead of buying a pair of binoculars, I bought this really nice high-powered scope that you can see. I forget what the strength of it is, but I could literally from that observation deck look into the nest of a bird and see what the mother bird was feeding the babies. It's just like, oh my God, it was pretty. It must have been like what it was like when people, first started having optical lenses and things to kind of amplify and magnify the world. It was having that scope is amazing. So I did a lot of observation and then some watercolors, and I took a bunch of pictures, but the pictures I'm not a great photographer, but they just look flat. I mean, with all these white specks and little white spots where the birds are and pink where the roseate spoonbills were, I could identify them, and I could kind of blow up like expand it and see things a little better. But I spent a long time composing it. And then as an artist, it really is composing a painting. I'm going off onto another tangent, but there is a lot of very consciously composed elements, and not just this painting, but every painting I do. I mean, there's kind of this internal geometry of how things move, how forms move through the composition, the repetition of shapes and forms, and to create rhythms, and just so it's visually compelling. I guess all artists have their bag of tricks to engage the viewer somehow. So that's to me that's a fun part. It's maybe the most creative part. Part of it is just observing nature and trying to understand it and identify things. But the actual act of composing is where the art to me comes into it.
I just realized it seems to be a common question that people ask you how long you take on a painting. And I think I just realized with this answer that there's the painting itself, but you can't really add up the hours spent at like the rookery itself, watching the birds, like photographing the birds. I'm thinking about all the watercolors, but just the time spent being there, which seems
I think but that there's a point. I mean, all of that, the travel, going down there and spending time, and I love all that. And you're right. That is kind of where the paintings begin, is all the way back there. But there's sort of an intermediate place before I even start the paintings that's taking all that information, all those sketches and watercolors, and I sit down and I'll start compiling the things that I want to include in a painting, and I'll start drawing, like just a real simple line drawing, and I'll just draw it over and over and over again, and I'll move things around, and I'm thinking there's probably a way with a computer or Photoshop or something to do this that would be take a fraction of the time. But I also think in that mental process of moving things and placing things, I don't know that there's something in there that I don't think a computer could replace exactly. I think once you've got something at a certain point, the computer's great because you can delete things, you can take things out. And I don't even know. I know there are new programs out there. I have an iPad that has some real simple things on it, but my favorite is just the Apple Pencil. I don't know if this. I was introduced to this, and it's a very fun drawing. It's a drawing device, but it's, if you don't like what you just drew, you can just hit a little arrow. It's like backspace, and it's gone. And if you realize, I like that, you can replace it. It's like it's just interesting. Living in this era of technology. But I'm still a pencil and paper type of person, and I like drawing things. But there's this long, well, I don't know how long, it varies, but it's definitely a stage in between the observations and sketches and watercolors that's the composing part. And to me, it's almost like a blueprint, figuring out where things are going to go, and the scale of things. I take a lot of liberties with scale, and then I kind of get it mostly figured out, or at least the basic blueprint for the painting, and then it's just painting. The actual painting might not even take as long as all of that leading up to it. But then frequently, once I'm into a painting, it continues to evolve, and I'll take things out or paint things in, and I realize the scale. Sometimes the scale is different. It doesn't work at a larger format. The scale of certain things don't work. So it continues to evolve, but it's kind of an interesting process that I think I've just stumbled my way into, and an effort to create paintings that hold together, and I guess I keep coming back to that word, that are visually compelling. But ultimately, as an artist, I think we want the work to grab people's attention and kind of hold them for a minute, and
So you're just talking about, trying to compose the paintings to get them to grab the viewer's attention. It makes me wonder how color comes into play and may be another way of getting people to stop and look and to engage with the paintings. Can you describe your relationship to color, or your use of very intense colors in a lot of instances?
I think I have a very strong relationship with color. And I've thought a lot about where that comes from. I do get people sometimes come and look at my paintings, and they're landscape elements. It's all natural birds and plants, and they comment on the colors seeming a little exaggerated or overemphasized, or even more, like surreal, psychedelic. I mean, they all kinds of descriptors for the color. But I've always responded to color, and I think human beings just do respond to color. And there are all kinds of psychological studies about how certain colors excite us, or like reds, and certain hot or warm colors put us in a certain mood, and certain cool colors, or have a calming effect. And I certainly believe that. And I have my own colors. I had a thing when I was a kid that we had black and white TV in my house growing up, and so it was very disappointing when The Wizard of Oz came on, because didn't get to experience the color until a few years later. But I remember it just as a kid, like when I was 4 or 5 years old, because I wasn't in school yet, and I didn't watch a lot of television. You can only get like 2 or 3 channels, but I could swear I could see color. And I guess that's the point of black and white, was the best they could do technologically. But I think it was assumed that we would as viewers imagine color when we looked at gray, different shades of gray. But I remember, telling my friends that that's red. I know that that color is red. And it was probably from the context but I swore in my head I was interpreting those shades of gray as different colors. But the other experience when I was also quite small, probably before school, was I was raised in a Catholic family. We went to church every Sunday, and we're fortunate to be in one of those old churches with big stained glass windows. And I really, um, I have to admit, I was more. I would not pay very close attention to what was being said. I mean, I could hear the sermons and I could hear the stories, and I did love the stories, but I would gaze up at those windows and the colors, that saturated color in the stained glass was really impactful to me. And I mean, I drew all the time when I was a kid. I'd get those big boxes of Crayolas. The first one was probably 12 colors or something, but getting the Crayola as saturated as possible. I think that my use of it now, my use of color now, is really about probably emphasis and also that attention getting. Drawing people in, drawing the viewer in, and I, you know, I've always used bright color, and probably with the exception of a few years, the last show I had here in 2018 was predominantly monochromatic, and it was intentional. I mean, I was starting to do paintings where I was removing color, except for maybe just a little detail here and there of some kind of color. And the first painting I did like that I thought was successful was a painting of monarch butterflies migrating, and the butterflies were in color, but the whole background, the whole landscape behind it was in just shades of gray, black and white and gray. And at the time, I thought of it as a kind of a metaphor for if the color washed out. Well, let's say if like a metaphor for extinction, like if these butterflies just disappeared completely, to me, it would be like, the world losing some of its color. And I guess I feel that way about all the, all the wildlife that's out there, birds especially, with all their different colors and plumage. And on a kind of a serious note, we are going, the world that we live in at present is, we're experiencing some of the greatest widespread extinctions in history. There have been other times in history, so it is a cyclical thing. And I don't know to what extent human beings have impacted that. I think there's no doubt that we have, but I also think it's more about we've populated the world. And I'd rather than dwell on our role in it, I think I'd rather try to find a more positive way to sort of address it, and maybe come to peace, some kind of peace for myself with it, but also make people think about it a little bit. And I thought a good way to do that would be visually, through painting, to like just the removal of color to me is like analogous to certain things disappearing. And so that painting started a series of other paintings that were predominantly black and white and gray, and I found them surprisingly soothing to look at. I think maybe just these warm shades of gray that they just look very calm and peaceful, even though there was a sort of a dark motivation behind it, or at least like the expression of something a little darker behind it. And I did 2 or 3 shows that were like that. One here, one in Dallas, about a year later, all with that kind of idea of what would the landscape look like, without color. but also being outdoors, especially in the wintertime, driving around and certain times of the day, the actual color that's out there washes away and you just see silhouettes, or you see, a much more monochromatic kind of look. So they didn't really come off seeming that like they weren't depressing to me, but also the grays were all mixed up with colors. It wasn't black paint mixed with white paint. It was, it was combinations of, complementary colors, reds and, burnt umbers and blues that made gray. And so even though it looked like monochromatic and just shades of gray, it was really full of color. It was just sort of the way it was combined. It wasn't bright saturated color. For this show, I made a conscious decision to bring color back and sort of be maybe a little more optimistic about it. And I do think it's uplifting to people to see color, more than, just something dark. And I think that somewhere in there, there's a fine line between something that looks sort of sugary sweet and something that just looks rich and, also possibly delicious, but in a good savory way. It's like, and I think that's the risk with color is using bright color, you really run the risk of having it sort of easily tip over into the sort of saccharine, too sweet. Yeah. And I think that's, I'm always aware of that because I feel like I get really close to that sometimes. And I think a lot of it's intuitive. I remember in graduate school, I went to school in UMass, and there were a couple of people up there that taught color theory that had, there was a gentleman, a professor there named John Roy, who had been a student of Joseph Albers. And they always had these group critiques where all these professors got together, I had a lot of color in my work then. The work was much more primitive and kind of almost like folk art, because that was another big inspiration of mine, was Mexican folk art and some of the folk art from southern United States that tended to not be afraid of color, and also especially the Mexican folk art was just over the top with color and all the textiles. And having grown up in a family that didn't have a lot of fine art on the walls, that's kind of what we had. My brother worked in the oil fields in South Texas, and we'd go down to visit and go across into Mexico, and he'd bring things back like those serapes and blankets, and it was just these gradations of color, these bands of real intense color, which now in retrospect, they were all made out of wool, and the wool was such a softer, the colors were softer than now. It's all polyesters, and they're glow in the dark colors. It's almost too extreme, which gets back to that, that fine line between color that's, a beautiful combination of color or sort of over the top and garish. But I've gone afield with my answer here, but I do think color is a real integral part of my work, and to me, it's just as important, and maybe more so than the compositions and the forms and the subject matter. And it is an intention thing. You want to pull people in. There's the old saying about the average time people spend looking at a work of art in a museum is 30 seconds or something. So if you can hold them for a minute, or a minute and a half, or just a little longer, then they might, you pull them into the work, and then they can begin to see other things that are going on. So I think colors in that regard is a device, to get people engaged, and then hopefully they'll spend some time and see the other things that are going on. And I do, most of my paintings look pretty straightforward, but there's usually there's usually other things. There's more to the story than just what immediately meets the eye. And I think color is one way to hold hold the attention long enough to appreciate those other levels.
Yeah, that's really the way I feel like I can remember. So the first time I saw your work in person was at the exhibition at the Art Museum of Southeast Texas, and I remember walking in and just feeling color and feeling that the color would pull me into a work. So
Hmm.
I always respond to red and green combinations, which you use. And so I think I remember walking over particularly to one of the prints that had that, and it's like the way to sort of grab, I think, people in the room, and everybody has colors that they respond to personally. And so I just feel like the intense color does that. You can walk in, and whatever color it is that person loves, it's like it can bring you in. Or if it's a color you actually find as the viewer very like almost too much, then it brings you in for that reason as well.
Right.
So I mean, I don't feel that way about the work because again, the color is one of the most alluring, I think, tools that you use. And also makes me think about color as experience, like color as feeling. And so I don't know, when I think about people saying like these colors almost seem kind of too much or something, I like, well, color is so personal, and I feel like that's what you just described.
Right.
And the shock, I imagine, of seeing like a pink bird in a landscape of green, and how pink that might feel and seem,
Hmm.
and how intense that could really be. Then I tend to, if somebody says, well, that bird can't be that pink, and I'm like, well, in a sea of green or blue, I just
Right.
see it
Right.
like glowing out there. I don't know.
Oh,
um,
I know. I agree. Every time I see, a cardinal fly by, or it's usually in a surrounding that's all shades of green and darker, kind of shadowy, shadows, and then it's like this. It's like a flame. This little bit of color comes through, and I read something somewhere about Ellsworth Kelly. When he was talking about some of the things that inspired his work. And up until that point, mostly what I'd seen of his, this was, 20 or 30 years ago, was, with those shaped, very minimal shaped, they were shaped, I don't know if they were canvases, but shaped pieces,
yeah.
like canvases that were all just one color. And then, he did a lot of other things, but primary colors and, sort of interesting shapes, but very reductive. And this was, I think, I don't know if he was even still alive then. I think he was. I'm sure he was. But this was just something he had written about an experience of his own experience of color. Walking in the woods, he saw a redstart, which is a bird we don't have. It's not real common where we live, but the redstart, there are several different kinds, but a common kind is kind of equal black and white with red, with some red detailing, so to speak. And he just saw it. It was sitting on a branch and it flew. And he saw these shapes, these real simple shapes of color, just kind of flash by. And I wish I could remember exactly what he said, but the takeaway was he had this experience in nature of this this presence of color in a probably predominantly darker, greener background, and it was one of those things that inspired his thinking about how to use color, and how to use these reductive shapes, and it just that got me thinking too a lot about how, as a tool and as a device, how many possibilities there are with it. From there was another artist, a Texas artist, Madeline O'Connor, who I got to meet when she was alive, and she did these beautiful minimal kind of installations, and they all had color, but they'd sometimes it'd just be a grid of squares of different colors. And I remember her talking about that too once, that it was a bird. I think it was a cedar waxwing, and she did a grid that had the sort of same proportions of colors, like these warm golds and ochres and browns, and then a bright yellow and a little spot of red. And it kind of also gets back to Mondrian, and his, reductive paintings. back to the just basic, primary colors. And well, I'm rambling, but I think that has a lot to do with how our brains process color too. I think the interpretation of shapes and images, like that's a frog, and there are birds back here, is sort of the final thing in the processing of a visual experience. We process colors and proportions of colors, and then sort of organize those in our brain, and then the logical side of our brain forms those into the shapes that we understand as birds or leaves or trees. And so I'm definitely on the intuitive end of the spectrum when it comes to using color, but in the little bit that I've read about it, it's, there's a whole science there, and our mental processing of how all that works is, it's what's fascinating. And they're still figuring things out about how we visualize. And that might be one of well, I'm always interested in how all the different animals, like flies, have 1,000 eyes, and deer only sees certain colors. And it's like we assume that the rest of the world sees the way we see, but I think even human beings, I think you said this, that we all see things differently. We all have different relationships with color, and how we visualize and interpret the world.
Yeah, I think there's an incredible variety, even from probably like you to me, where I might say this is purple with like a red undertone, and you might say, well, I see it actually as purple with more blue. I mean, I also think within just optically, like you're saying, science and individual like bodies and eyes, like there is a great variation. A lot of people have color blindness to certain degrees. And so I often think about that when people also come in and talk about the color, because I'll be like, wait, what are you seeing? Like, that's not what I see at all. And then it really does open up, though, I think, in terms of painting and art, even further of what's possible. And what you may be seeing is very particular to you, not only to your body, your eyes that day, and your childhood experiences, and the light, all of those things.
I've known at least 3 artists that are colorblind, and I think that's a spectrum too. I mean, some can just have certain colors. One, I think a common one is not being able to tell green and red apart, which is really fascinating because they seem so different, but again, the way our brains or our optics work, they're not. I can see where they, like for deer is not supposed to be able to tell the difference or see the difference, but anyway, it's fascinating.
It is fascinating. So we touch on the title of the exhibition, but it's also important to note that you've dedicated the exhibition to Frank X. Thalberg and to Anne Stopberg. And I was wondering if you would like to comment on Frank's influence as an artist, as a friend, on you, and I guess on the Texas art scene.
Yeah, well, it's interesting. I've done dedications before, usually in a written form, like if there's been a catalog for a show. I've had a couple of occasions where some artists or someone significant to me passed away, and it was more like just an acknowledgement, I guess, in those cases. And my original idea when I started this show was not to dedicate the show. I mean, I was already working on it when Frank passed away. And I met Frank and Anne over 30 years ago. I met him here in Houston, and I was kind of aware of who he was, but and his legacy is definitely he's his own person, and very much so, but he was born into a sort of a legacy with his father, who was the original Frank Thalberg that wrote for the Dallas Morning News and wrote all these great books about Texas. And in fact, one I'd highly recommend is I think it's the short history of Texas. Um, it's just a wonderful book describing him, Frank's dad, driving around with his 9-year-old son in a Jeep, back in the early 60s, trying to drive all the way around Texas, like all or along the border. And he never names Frank. It's always his 9-year-old son. and I thought, I was curious about that. And I asked Frank once, what's up with that? Why didn't he name me? He goes, well, maybe he hadn't named me yet. I don't know. But his dad was a character and started the chili cook-offs and in Terlingua and competed with Wick Fowler. There's a whole history there. It's very much, uniquely Texan, a unique product of Texas, I think, with, the chili and his dad's fascination with all these traveling around the state to obscure places and finding unusual people. And some of his columns, there's a whole other story there, I guess. And I'm sure I'll let the editor edit whatever it needs to be edited out. When I was about 11 or 12 years old, I I wanted a pet skunk, and they don't make very good pets, the truth be known, but I love skunks. I've always loved them. And in those days, back in the 50s and early 60s, you could buy skunks at pet stores almost. Not every pet store, but people did keep them as pets. And it was, at the time, I guess I got fascinated about this. I caught things and was always bringing home wildlife and trying to keep it, in my yard, and giving up eventually and turning it loose. But I was talking to a friend of mine about this, and we were in the car, and his grandmother, who was driving us, said, there is a skunk farmer up in North Texas that I read about in Talbert's Texas column. And I was like, oh, I need to know more about this. But she kind of gave me enough information to go home. And I actually called the Dallas Morning News and inquired about the article. And back in those days, you could actually talk to somebody and they'd go, oh, well, let me go through the files and I'll see if I can find that article. Well, I tracked this skunk farmer down. And of course, this was the guy that Frank Talbert's dad had written about, not once, but at least twice, and managed to get him on the What's My Line TV show, which was a thing when I was growing up, where they'd have somebody that had a very obscure job and so he was on TV at one point as a skunk farmer. But the show, it was a group of panelists that had to decide based on some clues, like what this person did. And anyway, I then talked my dad into taking me up. We met this guy, and I got my pet skunk. But this skunk farmer, I guess he really was an old trapper kind of guy that lived out in the middle of nowhere up in North Texas. And he and I became friends. My dad would take me up there occasionally, but I just was fascinated with him and at this place where he lived. It was out in the country. Way out in the country then. And I ended up going up there. My parents were very trusting, I guess, and I'd camp out and go hunting, go walking around the woods with this old man. He was in his late 60s then, my age now. But, and he knew everything. He knew where to find a tree with a beehive inside it with honey. And he took me down into these places that were just old hollows, and it was just, he had a bunch of hound dogs, and we'd chase a raccoon or chase something, and never shot anything. It was all just the chase, and he did it for exercise, I guess. But that was a very impactful experience to me, and the closest I'd probably gotten to, sort of another slice of historical time, because this guy was sort of cut from another era. And he told a lot of stories about, I'm sure, the stories that were handed down to him when he was a kid. But anyway, I'm sure this was family lore, but the stories were so real, and these towns all around where he lived are still there, like Pilot Point and Sanger, Texas. These little towns that, um, to me, it was like a living, sort of a continuation of this historical link to the past. And anyway, I think Frank's, I think his dad for sort of bringing that experience in. And I admittedly took it a little further. Instead of just reading the story, I got pretty involved with, it sort of was life altering in a way. But so anyway, when I met Frank, he came into my studio, and I had a studio downtown in Old Market Square, in a building that eventually became Diverse Works, and which is still around, not in that location anymore. But Frank and Ann just walked in one day and introduced themselves, and I immediately launched into my story about meeting John Anderson and how thankful I was that his dad wrote that column. And Frank was like, yeah, my dad drove me all over Texas. So he ran around with his dad. I was trying to figure out when he ever went to school. But we just kind of connected then. And we didn't become real good friends until later on. I mean, it was sort of 30 years of sort of crossing paths and talking and kind of sharing things. But I don't know. I know I'm not the only one that became, pretty fond of, Ann and Frank, and we got to be even closer friends. But I moved away. They moved from Houston they moved to Galveston. They were living in Galveston, I think, when I left Houston, and we just kind of stayed in touch sporadically. But I mean, Frank was connected to tons of people, Frank and Ann, and they were a real important part of the Houston community, and sort of larger than life, I think, in a lot of ways. I mean, if I had to describe Frank's approach to painting, it would be, he's fearless and also filterless. It's all out there. There's no, I don't know, it's bold and unapologetic. And for years, most of his work was sort of narrative about his life and Ann's life. And then, I don't know how many years ago, it's probably been 10 years, he started painting birds. And I remember thinking, I've been painting birds now for a long time. And for better or worse, my work kind of became identified with painting birds. And then when Frank started painting birds, I thought, you're getting into my territory here a little. But his approach to it was so different that I was, I loved his work. And especially the birds, because it was sort of like we have this common language, this thing that we're both fascinated by. And a lot of the places that he went to paint, especially like the Smith Oaks Rookery, was a real, a place he went back to again and again. And I went to other places, and I was never a real, bird watcher in the conventional sense, but it was a subject that always fascinated me. And so when he started, I just thought, this is good for the birds. It's good for, it's, I thought he was also good for this gallery, because there was a raw kind of edginess to his work. And it, there's I don't know how to describe it, kind of a level of depth or a soulfulness or something about the work that he did. And so when he passed away in July, like everyone else, I wasn't expecting it. We were traveling. We were out of the country at the time, so I didn't get the word for 2 or 3 days. And we had just seen him, and been with him a few times, right just the weeks before we went out of town. And I think the impact of when it was so unexpected, even though every time we saw Frank, he he'd joke about, wanting to get a project done while he could. And I'm thinking, I, I felt like he's been talking about, being, like concerned about dying for years. And then sure enough, I think he was sort of lined up to do, he did that beautiful series of Texas birds. And then he was starting a children's book on insects, which we got to look at, some of all the drawings for it. It was just like an alphabet book, with all these, great, like C is for centipede, and of course in his style. And I hope the book happens. I think it could, because I think he'd done all the drawings for it. But of course, there's a great praying mantis, and all in his style. There's just so. But that was the project. He was really hoping to see it get published, and hopefully it will. And so when this show came up, I had the idea. I'd wanted to do a Smith Oaks rookery painting. I had the watercolors. And I don't know. I guess it was something I thought I would get to eventually. And then in the preparation for this show, I decided I would do a painting that was kind of a dedication to Frank. And I considered putting him and Anne in the painting, because they sent us a video a couple of winters ago during the migration, and it's him and Anne on that observation deck looking at the birds, and it's a really, it's a great piece. But I just opted to do the painting just of the rookery, and then I was talking to BB, my girlfriend, about dedicating the painting to him, and she actually said, you should just dedicate the whole show to him. And I thought, well, that seems like a big gesture. I mean, a gesture that it's timely for sure. And I guess I felt slightly self-conscious about it at first, but then I thought, no, why not? I mean, life is short for all of us, and this is a good opportunity. And the piece is, I think he would have totally appreciated the subject matter. And then I think she also suggested, we should honor Anne at the same time. I mean, they were so interconnected, and still are. So we're actually going to an event. Well, this weekend is the remembrance exhibit of Frank's work. So it's partly another reason to be in town for that. But it was just, special thing. It just seemed like an opportunity to acknowledge him. And I don't know that his style influenced me as much as just the spirit behind it and the motivation behind it. And I mean, knowing he was just a lot of fun to be around, both of them. So he'll be missed.
Thank you. I feel like we covered our questions.